The Thompsons were a family that seemed to have it all: money, success, and a picture-perfect life in their sprawling suburban home. To their neighbors, they were the epitome of happiness, the kind of family everyone envied. But behind closed doors, the reality was far different. Grace Thompson had married Andrew 2 years after the death of her first husband. Andrew was charismatic, wealthy, and treated Grace's daughter, Sophie, like his own Sophie, now 19. Was a college freshman studying psychology. She was a bright, spirited young woman who had been the center of Grace's world since her birth. At first, their blended family seemed to be a happy one. Andrew doted on Sophie, buying her expensive gifts and showering her with attention. Grace was relieved, believing that she had finally found a man who would care for her and her daughter. But over time, she began to notice things that made her uneasy: hushed conversations between Andrew and Sophie, the way he looked at her when he thought Grace wasn't watching, and the sudden shift in Sophie's behavior. One evening, Grace came home early from a work trip to find a house eerily quiet. As she made her way upstairs, she heard a muffled noise coming from Sophie's room. Her heart raced as she approached the door, which was slightly ajar. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. There in the dim light was Andrew, in bed with Sophie, her daughter, her husband. The shock of it paralyzed Grace, but only for a moment. She quickly backed away, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. How long had this been going on? How could they betray her like this? Grace fled the house, driving aimlessly through the night, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She had devoted her life to Sophie, sacrificed everything for her daughter's happiness and Andrew. She had trusted him with her heart, her life, and her family. The betrayal was too much to bear. When she finally returned home, it was nearly dawn. Grace forced herself to keep calm, to act as though nothing had happened. She knew she needed time to process what she had seen, to figure out her next move. But one thing was certain: she would not let them get away with this. In the days that followed, Grace meticulously concealed her emotions, pretending that everything was normal. She went through the motions of daily life, but inside, she was seething with anger and hurt. She watched Andrew and Sophie closely, noting every interaction, every look they shared. Andrew, oblivious to the fact that Grace knew their secret, continued his charade of being the perfect husband. He kissed Grace goodbye each morning, reassured her of his love, and made plans for their future. It was all a lie, and Grace knew it. Sophie, on the other hand, became more withdrawn. She avoided Grace whenever possible, her guilt evident in the way she refused to meet her mother's eyes. Grace could see the fear in Sophie, and it only fueled her anger. As Grace continued to gather evidence of their affair, she felt herself growing colder, more calculating. She documented their secret meetings, taking photos and saving text messages she found on Andrew's phone. She knew she could confront them at any moment, but Grace was no longer satisfied with a simple confrontation. She wanted revenge, revenge that would leave them devastated, just as they had devastated her. Grace's plan began to take shape in her mind. She would destroy them both, but she would do it in a way that left no trace back to her. She knew that Andrew and Sophie thought they had the upper hand, that they could continue their affair without consequence. But they had underestimated Grace's resolve. One afternoon, while Andrew was at work, Grace sat down with Sophie in the kitchen. Sophie fidgeted nervously. Sensing that something was wrong, Grace began, her voice calm and controlled. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Sophie's face paled, and she shook her head. "No, Mom. Why?" Grace leaned in, her eyes piercing. "I know about you and Andrew." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she began to stammer an apology, but Grace held up her hand to stop her. "I don't want to hear it," Grace said, her voice cold. "You've made your choices, and now you'll have to live with them." Sophie's tears flowed freely now. "Mom, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. He said he loved me." Grace's heart twisted with a mix of rage and sorrow. He's a liar. Sophie. And now, because of him, we're all going to suffer. Grace had never felt more alone. She couldn't bear to look at Sophie, let alone speak to her. The betrayal had cut too deep, and every time she saw her daughter, all she could think about was what she had lost: trust, innocence, and the bond they had shared. Andrew continued to act as though nothing was wrong, but Grace knew better. She saw through his facade, recognizing the guilt in his eyes every time he looked at her. He knew that something had changed, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Grace began to isolate herself from both of them. She spent long hours at work, avoiding coming home until late at night. When she was at home, she kept herself, retreating to her bedroom with the door locked. Andrew tried to talk to her several times, but Grace brushed him off, claiming that she was just stressed from work. But in reality, she was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to put her plan into action. Meanwhile, Sophie was a wreck. She knew she had destroyed her relationship with her mother, and she had no idea how to fix it. She hated herself for what she had done, but she was also hopelessly in love with Andrew. It was a twisted, toxic love, and Sophie knew it, but she couldn't help herself. The tension in the house was unbearable. Grace could feel it like a thick fog that hung over them all. She knew she had to act soon before the pressure became too much to bear. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Grace finally confronted Andrew. She waited until he was sitting in his study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. He looked up from his book as she entered, a smile on his face that quickly faded when he saw the look in her eyes. "Grace, what's wrong?" he asked, concerned in his voice. Grace didn't answer right away. She walked over to his desk, placing the stack of photos and printed text messages in front of him. Andrew's face went white as he realized what he was looking at. "Grace, I don't," she said, cutting him off. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I know everything, Andrew." Andrew opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped, and he knew it. "Why?" Grace demanded, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Andrew finally said. His voice, barely above a whisper, adjusted just did. "I'm sorry, Grace. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me," Grace repeated, her voice rising. "You've destroyed me. You've destroyed this family." Andrew had no answer. He hung his head, knowing that there was nothing he could say to make things right. Grace stood there for a long moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to hit him, to make him feel the pain she was feeling, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough. Finally, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Andrew to sit in silence as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Grace knew that she couldn't let him get away with this. She couldn't let either of them get away with it. Her plan was set in motion. Grace knew that she had to be careful, that she couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. She had to think clearly, to plan every detail meticulously if she was going to make Andrew and Sophie pay for what they had done. She had to be smart about it. And over the next few weeks, Grace began to lay the groundwork for her plan. She started with small things, subtle changes that neither Andrew nor Sophie noticed at first. She began altering their routines, suggesting that they take different routes to work, or that they start locking the doors at night. She planted seeds of doubt in their minds, making them question each other's motives and actions. At the same time, Grace began to distance herself from her friends and colleagues. She stopped going out, stopped answering calls, and started spending more time alone. She wanted to create the impression that she was struggling, that she was on the edge. It was all part of her plan. Then one evening, Grace suggested that they go on a family vacation. It was a last-ditch effort, she said, to try and salvage what was left of their family. Andrew, desperate to make things right, agreed without hesitation. Sophie was reluctant at first, but Grace convinced her that it was the only way they could start to heal. They decided on a remote cabin in the woods, far away from the city and any prying eyes. It was a place they had visited once before, early in their marriage, and Grace knew it well. It was the perfect setting for what she had planned. As they packed their bags and prepared for the trip, Grace's heart pounded with anticipation. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She had everything she needed, and she was ready to put her plan into action. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, but the tension in the car was palpable. Andrew tried to make small talk, but Grace's responses were curt and distant. Sophie stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what the weekend might bring. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. When they arrived at the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken dread. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and the silence was almost suffocating. Grace took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Inside the cabin, Grace went through the motions of settling in. She unpacked their bags, prepared a simple dinner, and tried to keep the mood light. But every smile she forced felt like a knife twisting in her heart. As night fell, they sat around the fireplace, the crackling flames, the only sound in the room. Andrew and Sophie exchanged glances, both of them sensing that something was wrong, but neither of them willing to address it. Grace watched them, her mind calculating, her heart hardening. Finally, she stood up and announced that she was going to bed. Andrew offered to join her, but she declined, saying she needed some time alone. He hesitated, then nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hallway. Sophie lingered by the fire, her thoughts a tangled mess. She felt a deep sense of unease, a nagging, feeling that something terrible was about to happen, but she pushed the thoughts away, convincing herself that she was just being paranoid. As she finally made her way to bed, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm, in the middle of the night. Grace silently slipped out of bed. She had been waiting for this moment, and now it was time to act. She moved through the cabin with the stealth of a predator, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Grace headed to the kitchen and retrieved a bottle of wine she had brought along. She poured herself a glass, then added a few drops of a potent sedative she had secretly obtained. She knew it would be enough to knock them out for hours, giving her the time she needed. She returned to the living room, where Andrew and Sophie were still sleeping by the fire. Grace gently shook Andrew awake, offering him the glass of wine. He accepted it without question, too groggy to notice anything amiss. Sophie stirred as well, and Grace handed her a glass too. "Let's have one last toast," Grace said, her voice eerily calm to new beginnings. They clinked their glasses together, and Grace watched as they both drank deeply. Within minutes, the sedative took effect. Andrew and Sophie's heads lulled back, their eyes closing as they slipped into unconsciousness. Grace stood over them, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She felt a rush of adrenaline, a surge of power that made her feel invincible. Without hesitation, Grace set to work. She tied Andrew's hands and feet together with rope, making sure the knots were tight. Then she did the same to Sophie, her hands trembling slightly as she secured the bindings. She didn't want to hurt them yet, but she needed to make sure they couldn't escape. When they were both securely tied, Grace sat down in a chair opposite them, waiting for them to wake up. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if the storm inside her had finally been unleashed. It was time for them to pay. When Andrew and Sophie finally awoke, they were groggy and disoriented. It took them a moment to realize what was happening. But when they did, panic set in. They struggled against their bonds. But it was no use. They were trapped. Grace watched them in silence, her eyes cold and unfeeling. She felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. As she saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were at her mercy. "Grace, what are you doing?" Andrew demanded, his voice shaky. Grace didn't answer right away. She let the silence hang in the air, watching as they both became more frantic. "Why are you doing this?" Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, please." Grace finally spoke, her voice steady and emotionless. "You betrayed me, both of you, and now you're going to pay for what you've done." Andrew's face twisted in anger. "Grace, you're not thinking clearly. Let us go, and we can talk about this." But Grace only shook her head. "There's nothing to talk about, Andrew. I've seen everything. The text, the photos, the lies. You both disgust me." Sophie sobbed, her words barely coherent through her tears. "Mom, please. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing." Grace's expression didn't change. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Sophie. And so did you, Andrew." Andrew tried to reason with her, but Grace wasn't listening. She was beyond reason, beyond forgiveness. She had been pushed too far, and now she was going to make them suffer. She stood up, walking over to where Andrew was tied. "I loved you, Andrew. I trusted you, and you threw it all away. For what? For this?" Andrew stared up at her, his ease pleading. "Grace, please don't do this. We can fix this. We can go back to the way things were." But Grace only laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "There's no going back. Not after what you've done." She turned her back on him, moving towards Sophie. "And you, Sophie, you were my daughter, my only child. I would have done anything for you. But now you're just as guilty as he is." Sophie's sobs grew louder, her body shaking with fear. "Mom, please, I'm begging you, don't do this." But Grace was unmoved. She felt nothing but a cold, dark satisfaction as she prepared to carry out the final part of her plan. Grace knew there was no turning back. She had reached the point of no return, and now she had to see it through to the end. She had already taken everything from them, their freedom, their trust, their dignity, and now she was going to take their lives. She retrieved a knife from the kitchen, the blade gleaming in the dim light. She had chosen it carefully, knowing that it would be the perfect tool for what she was about to do. She had thought about this moment for so long, and now it was finally here. As she approached Sophie, the girl's eyes widened in terror. "Mom, no, please don't." Grace hesitated for a moment, her resolve wavering, but then she remembered the betrayal, the lies, the pain they had caused her. She steeled herself, raising the knife high above her head. But just as she was about to strike, Sophie screamed. The sound pierced the silence, echoing through the cabin and jarring Grace back to reality. She stumbled back, the knife falling from her hand. For a moment, Grace just stood there, trembling as the weight of what she had almost done hit her. She had been so consumed by her hand. For a moment, Grace just stood there, trembling as the weight of what she had almost done hit her. She had been so consumed by her anger, her need for revenge, that she had nearly done the unthinkable, She had almost killed her own daughter. Grace's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked down at Sophie, who was still sobbing uncontrollably. Andrew was shouting something, but Grace couldn't hear him over the pounding of her own heart. She backed away, her mind racing, her thoughts a chaotic mess. What had she become? What had this betrayal turned her into? Without thinking, Grace turned and ran out of the cabin into the cold night air. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away, had to escape the madness that had taken hold of her. She ran through the woods, her feet pounding the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping through her hair as she looked down at the rocky shore below. For a moment, Grace considered ending it all. She could just step off the edge, and all the pain, all the anger would be gone. She wouldn't have to live with the guilt, the shame, the horror of what she had almost done. But as she stood there, staring down at the jagged rocks below, something inside her shifted. She realized that ending her life wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal. It wouldn't bring back the trust. And it wouldn't erase the pain. Grace took a deep breath, forcing herself to step back from the edge. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let Andrew and Sophie destroy her. She was stronger than that. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She knew what she had to do. When Grace returned to the cabin, she found Andrew and Sophie still tied up, their eyes filled with fear as she entered the room. But Grace was no longer the vengeful woman who had left them. She was calm, her mind clear, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had almost done. Without a word, Grace untied them both, her hands shaking as she released the knots. Neither Andrew nor Sophie spoke as they were freed, too afraid to ask what had changed, too relieved to be out of danger. Grace stepped back, her eyes downcast, unable to meet their gazes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Andrew stood up, rubbing his wrist where the ropes had left marks. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. Sophie just sat there, tears streaming down her face, her body still trembling with fear. Grace turned away from them, unable to face the reality of what she had done. She had let her anger consume her, had let it drive her to the brink of madness, and in doing so, she had nearly destroyed the very thing she had been trying to protect her family. She walked to the door, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look back as she opened it, stepping out into the cold night. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to leave, had to get away from the memories of what had happened in that cabin. As she walked into the darkness, Grace felt a deep sense of loss, a hollow emptiness that she knew would never be filled. She had lost everything, her husband, her daughter, and most of all, herself. But she was still alive, and that meant she still had a chance to make things right. It wouldn't be easy, and it meant she still had a chance to make things right. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But Grace knew she had to try. She had to find a way to forgive herself, to move forward, to rebuild the life that had been shattered. And so, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of her guilt on her shoulders, Grace walked into the night, determined to find a way to heal. It took months, but Grace eventually found her way back to herself. She moved to a small town far from the city, where no one knew her name, where she could start over. She found a job, rented a modest apartment, and began the slow, painful process of healing. She reached out to Sophie, sending her letters, trying to explain, trying to make amends. It was a long and difficult journey, but eventually Sophie, sending her letters, trying to explain, trying to make amends. It was a long and difficult journey, but eventually Sophie forgave her. They began to rebuild their relationship slowly, cautiously, but with a newfound understanding of each other's pain. As for Andrew, he and Grace divorced, but they parted on amicable terms. He moved on with his life, and so did she, both of them scarred by what had happened, but stronger for having survived it. Grace knew she would never forget the betrayal, the anger, the madness that had consumed her, but she also knew that she couldn't let it define her. She was more than the mistake she had made, more than the anger that had driven her to the brink. She was a survivor, a mother, a woman who had faced the darkest parts of herself and come out on the other side. And as she stood on the porch of her new home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Grace felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had found her way back to herself, and now she was ready to start a new chapter, a chapter of healing, of forgiveness, of hope, a new beginning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.